Hi, everybody. It's Matt Robinson. Welcome to another edition of the Writer's Block. The writer's life can be a busy one, but I don't think I've met a writer, at least not on this show, that's this busy. Our guest today is Dain. He is the co-founder and chairman of the real estate law firm Dain, Torpy, LeRae, Weiss, and Garner, PC, and a gavel board member of the Massachusetts chapter of the National Association of Industrial and Office Properties. He's also a Massachusetts Fellow of the American Bar Association, which is a recognition given to less than 1% of the lawyers in each state. Here in Needham, he chairs the town's golf club advisory committee and serves as the treasurer on the Needham Land Trust. He's also a co-founder of the Restaurant Investment Group and is on the boards of A Better City, the Vilna Shul, and the Real Estate Bar Association of Massachusetts, for which he also serves as co-chair of its real estate litigation team. In his spare time, he lectures on land use and litigation issues at Boston College, MIT, Northeastern, and the Boston Bar Association, the Real Estate Bar Association, and actually is teaching a class at Needham Community Education. As a writer, he has been published in Banker and Tradesman, the Real Estate Bar Association News, and New England Law Review. He edited a book on deposition practice for James Publishing, and is also the author of this little volume, A History of Boston, which will be the main topic today. It is an amazing book. You know, being a fellow native Bostonian, New Englander, et cetera, I thought I knew a lot, but it's an education, and I've really enjoyed digging into it. Somehow Dan was able to find some time to come join us today, and we're honored and pleased to have him. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks so much to be here, Matt.
It's great. It's great. Seriously, how you do this all, maybe we'll get to that, but so we're from here. We have a view of Boston that maybe the rest of the country doesn't quite share. Where do you see Boston as sort of like, you know, is it a city? Is it a town with delusions of grandeur? Where does it fit in for you?
I think you can make a compelling argument, which I do in the book, that Boston has the most important history of any American city. You know, it's hard to argue that Boston is a more important city per se than New York, but its history in terms of its role in the settlement of America, its role leading up to the Revolutionary War, its role in kickstarting the Industrial Revolution, the start of the abolition movement was really here, women's rights movement. So many important events in American history occurred in Boston and in Massachusetts that I think it really deserves its place as the city with the most important history in the United States.
What was the moment of that history that sparked your interest and said, you know, made you go forward and back to get all the rest of the context for the book?
Being from Boston, I was born in Boston. I grew up in Newton. I've lived in Needham since 2000, so for 24 years. It's a city that I've always loved. I work downtown. I love the history. I love taking tours. I love reading books about the history. What motivated the book project really stemmed from my professional interest in what makes cities successful. My law practice is representing real estate developers in the city. And when my clients make investment decisions in the city, they're sort of betting on the fact that the city is going to remain a place where people want to, as I say, live, work, play, study, visit, shop in Boston. But I knew that Boston, despite flying high today, when I grew up in the 70s and 80s, the best term to describe Boston was basket case. Boston was in the process of spending really 70 years of stagnation from about 1920 into the 1990s. And so I was interested in what made Boston swing between these periods of success and failure. And so I actually started the endeavor of doing research on Boston history really to understand that question. And it was really only about 2 years in that I thought, geez, maybe I'll take all these notes and try to put them into a book.
Where were your main sources of information? Was it the archives, the Athenaeum, the library?
I really wanted to learn the history myself, so it's not like I sat down with an outline on the history and was just, you know, filling it in. I was just trying to read as much as I could about the city. So there's not a lot of primary research in the book. It's really a collection of stories that I discovered on my journey. It's about 800 pages, but it can be read as maybe 1,000 different short stories about Boston history, woven together in what I think is a compelling narrative addressing the sort of themes of what makes cities successful or not successful. And so, I relied on the work of a lot of other great researchers and writers and historians For the process, I read 265 books about different aspects of Boston history over a 4-year period, cover to cover, because I really wanted to learn the history, and I took notes on those. I read over 500 magazine articles, newspaper articles, journals, as well as visited over 70 historic sites. And so from my notes on all of that, this book emerged.
And so you're announcing your candidacy for mayor? You probably know it better than most of our...
I enjoy being behind the scenes.
Okay. Well, I apologize for shining the light on you, but it definitely, the work deserves recognition.
Thank you.
How did you frame it? Is it from the first settlers until the day you published, or did you find was it weighted in either way?
You know, a lot of people ask, like, well, why don't you start, with modern history, because that's really the most interesting part, or start after the Puritans arrived. But I felt I needed to start with the geologic history to understand what followed after. So I start 580 million years ago with the formation of what's called the Avalon Belt in the Southern Ocean, which was a series of volcanoes that came together and drifted north and was crushed between the North American continent and Africa and Europe to form Pangea. And then when it pulled apart, it essentially went with North America, and that's the old Avalon Belt is essentially the plain between the Appalachian Mountains and the Atlantic Ocean. And understanding that history and the history after that of the glacier, the ice ages and the glaciers that formed the drumlins and the glacial and the gravel deposits, the fact that Boston is a city with a harbor, the fact that there are rivers, all then play into its maritime history, its industrial history. So starting with that geographic and geologic history, I thought was important to set the stage, and then I followed that with history of the arrival of first peoples about 9,000 to 12,000 years ago, through the arrival of the Pilgrims and the Puritans, all the way up. And then as I was writing to the present, which was a real challenge because the present kept changing every day, and every day I would read newspaper stories about things that I thought should be included, and so I was cutting them out and adding them to the end of the book. So I needed an endpoint, and thought that the election of Michelle Wu as the first woman and first person of color to be elected mayor of Boston was a good way to end the book.
So are you working on volume 2? There's a question I get a lot with my book, but are you working? Because you probably have, how many more notes do you have that didn't make it?
The original manuscript was 900 pages.
All right, not bad.
It was going to be a burdensome, it was going to be a challenge to the binding and a little heavy for people. So I made sure to try to cut about 100 pages of content.
Yeah, cutting is the hardest part. So talking about the land issues, which of course is your wheelhouse in real estate, there's a tie between Needham and Boston in terms of land, like physical land.
Yes, if you're referring to the filling of the Back Bay.
Yes.
From Needham Heights. And so Needham Heights was formed as many of the drumlins around Boston through glacial deposits, which meant that the old hills of Needham Heights were gravel. If they had been bedrock, you wouldn't have been able to use them for fill, at least not without a lot of blasting. And so rail cars were going 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, from Needham Heights to the Back Bay, and the gravel from Needham Heights was largely used to fill in the Back Bay till Needham Heights was dug out, and then some other sites were used as well.
So is Needham Heights not as high as it once was?
It's not as high as it once was.
We've reached the heights and we did our part.
That's right.
Yeah. So is there any sort of were other towns involved, or is it just particularly the gravel here was well suited for the need?
Well, I think the gravel is no different from other glacial deposits, but it was the contractors for the filling of the Back Bay signed contracts to secure land rights here, and it was a straight shot in order to build the rail line. But once Needham Heights were sort of filled out, there were several different locations that were added as well. I think Hyde Park, I think a couple other locations, I forget, but most of the fill came from Needham Heights.
And the rail line is the commuter rail line, or was it a different setup? It
approximately goes where, if you know where the D line of the Green Line goes, and then from Newton Highlands it turns toward Riverside, but in fact there's a line which follows essentially parallel to Needham Heights, to Needham Street in Newton Highlands, behind that Avalon Bay housing development, which has been converted to a rail trail today, I think. Right. And that's approximately where the spur was that led out to Needham.
So you set the parameters. You organize the book according to what you call watershed moments, with all the important local and national history that's been centered in our area. How did you choose these seminal moments to, how did you choose the high points among high points?
So I didn't start with an organization that focused on, I think I came up with 5 or 6 watershed moments. That sort of came a little bit later as I was getting it all organized, and it struck me that there were certain events in the history of the region that were truly pivots from sort of one era to another. So the arrival of European settlers, particularly the Puritans in 1630, you have the Revolutionary War, you have the rise of the Industrial Revolution, you have the collapse of the industrial economy in the 1920s, and then the rise of the knowledge-based economy in the 1990s.
What were some of the most surprising things that you came upon? I mean, you had this interest in the history. It sounds like most of your life, not all your life. Were there things that you didn't even know that really got you excited, maybe set you off on a path you hadn't expected?
At 800 pages, there were lots of facts that I didn't know when I dug into it, and that was a lot of fun to do the discovery. And as a trial lawyer during the day, I think my one skill is taking large amounts of information and organizing it in a way and telling it a compelling narrative that's interesting. I think my skill is less as a historian, more as a storyteller. The one story from the history of Boston that surprised me the most, because I think it's so historically significant and yet I had never heard of it, was the first civil rights movement in United States history takes place in Boston in the 1840s with the free black community in Boston using all the tools of the American civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, boycotting, petitioning, civil disobedience, and using those tools to fight against legal segregation of Boston in the 1840s. In 1843, the rail lines in Massachusetts were desegregated. 1843, the law against interracial marriage was repealed by the General Court, which is the state's legislature. 1847, Robert Morris becomes the first African-American member of the bar in Massachusetts, only the second African-American member of the bar in the United States. And the big one, 1851, the schools were legally desegregated, although, as we know, they essentially resegregated in the 20th century, leading to school busing. But I had no idea that there was such a significant civil rights movement led by the black community itself in Boston.
How do you think that, if they had this experience and the success, how did it get so pushed back in our lifetimes?
A lot of policies in the 20th century that resegregated the city through zoning, through racial covenants, through discrimination in employment opportunities, through banking and political policies in terms of where mortgage lending could happen and redlining. A long and sordid history in the 20th century of the city resegregating. This probably isn't the venue to go into the history of racial relations in Boston. That's, I think, a discussion for another day, but there were some interesting insights. Yeah, it's a big part of the decline of the city in the 20th century. And in my book, I really explore how the fact that the people in the city stopped listening to each other and stopped spending time with people like them was a major cause of the stagnation that the city saw from about 1920 to the 1990s.
Yeah, I think we're seeing that on a larger scale, but
yeah.
That's your next book. How is Boston able to keep coming back, or at least in this most recent upswing?
Yeah, there's been quite a transformation in the 1990s. Multiple causes. We cleaned up the environment. Crime fell, both political crime as well as organized crime and street crime fell quite a bit, making people feel safer to come back into the city. With the environment being cleaned up, Boston became a healthier place to spend time. We started re-embracing better pro-urban policies of investing in the city. The depressing of the central artery made Boston, was a major infrastructure investment in the city that made Boston a much more pleasant place to be. And then it was driven also quite a bit by companies who had learned lessons from the Massachusetts Miracle, which was a suburban-based rise of high tech, where companies were isolated in suburban office campuses and were not able to innovate a second time. And so the lesson that a lot of companies took from that and took from the success of Silicon Valley in the 1990s was the importance for companies of locating in cities where there's a whole ecosystem where people get to interact with other people with different ideas. And so companies started moving back into Boston, and employees really followed. And Boston started being a place where people wanted to live and work again.
I grew up in the Lowell area when Wang was the Big Bang,
right.
and now it's Crosspoint. So because they just were so on their own in the industry and
So
geographically.
Isolated. Yeah, the Wangs, the Digitals, all those companies of Polaroids really isolated themselves, and they're all gone today.
And now you have Kendall Square, which is like biotech center of the world, basically.
Yeah, and Biogen decides to move out of Cambridge and move to Weston in a suburban campus. And 3 years later, they turn around and move back into Cambridge because they couldn't get employees to come out and work in Weston. People today are really rejecting the sort of car-dependent, high carbon impact lifestyles, young people today, and want to be in cities, which is exciting for Boston and for cities all around the world.
Along those lines, if you were looking ahead, if you could recommend one maybe change to the infrastructure or how the city is run from what you've learned through your research, what would be like the next big watershed moment that you would like to see for the city?
Well, so I talk about whether or not we're in a new watershed moment of decline because of the challenges we face today. The housing crisis, transportation crisis, climate change crisis. There are different ways of measuring how vulnerable cities are to climate change, particularly sea level rise. But by most metrics, Boston's considered one of the top 10 most vulnerable cities in the world for rising sea levels. And we've seen this already with flooding in the seaport, and so much of our infrastructure is below ground that if you look at flood maps in 2050 or 2070, it's really quite frightening. So we have some major challenges that are facing the city, and the question is whether we have the political will to invest in the city, to embrace the good tenets of urbanism. And I do think that building housing, investing in public transportation is the best land use response we have to these crises.
Having gone on a lot of the same tours and learned a lot of the same, Boston is known for its firsts, but not always its bests. Mm-hmm. What are some of the ideas that came up in Boston that you really think have, other than the medical and technological advances, like ideas for how a city is run and organized that should be spread or have been spread to the benefit of other municipalities?
Boston was really showed how cities should not be run, as I said, from 1920 or so to the 1990s. And Boston was not alone, but we had federal, state, and local policies that were highly anti-urban. And we built highways to move people out of cities. Through urban renewal, we tore down dense neighborhoods, and we really destroyed the city for so long. We're trying to reverse those. We started rebelling against more highways. There's been some investment in public transportation and the depressing of the central artery, and we certainly talk a lot about the importance of building housing again in the city. Those are struggles, and they're politically very challenging, but other cities are looking at the same issues and watching Boston as a real bellwether as whether or not cities can be successful on these fronts.
Even though it is not the largest, or in some ways at least, most significant city, the mayor of Boston, in my lifetime, has had some sway among the Council of Mayors. Following up on the previous question, what do you think it is about the challenges of Boston that make the decisions the mayor makes influential elsewhere?
I think Boston being such a leader in healthcare, in life sciences today, in education, has always been seen as an intellectual leader in the country. And so many of the top thinkers today on urban issues come out of Boston, people like Jeff Speck, who wrote a very influential book called The Walkable City. It's always been a place where urban ideas percolate out of, and in that respect has been disproportionately influential historically and today.
So Boston is still the city on the hill that it was hoped to be?
Well,
or the hill is smaller because they filled in the land?
John Winthrop's words were meant to be aspirational. We should treat the place where the Puritans were coming as if it were a city upon a hill for the whole world to look to. And the world has looked to Boston in so many periods of time, from the Revolutionary War and the Industrial Revolution, abolition, women's rights movement, as I mentioned, through the decline of the city for so long, and then the rise of a knowledge-based economy, which has made Boston one of the economically most powerful centers in the world. And so, yes, the world has looked to Boston in some ways as a city upon a hill for so long.
Do you think it still warrants that attention?
Economically today, it's one of the most powerful centers in the world.
Because of the intellectual capital?
Because of the intellectual capital. It's the largest life science cluster in the world. I believe 18 of the 20 largest pharmaceutical companies in the world have some presence in Boston. As of a couple years ago, it was number 3 in the world in terms of venture capital investing. Certainly number 1 in universities, number 1 in hospitals. At the time I wrote the book, it was number 1 in sports teams. Thankfully, the Celtics are the best team in the NBA today, and the Bruins have the 3rd best record, I think, or so in the NHL.
We won't talk about the other.
But the other teams are struggling a little bit.
Well, the women's hockey team, they're doing very well. The new professional women's hockey league team.
I thought they won the Isabel Cup the last 2 years in a row, but in the reorganized league, they haven't been quite as successful this season.
We'll have to see how the trade. I think it's the new uniforms. I like the Pride uniforms better. But anyway, so when you present your book, like you're doing at the Needham Community Education, what is the most prevalent question that people come up with? What do you see as the biggest realm of interest that your readers or people who maybe not have read it yet?
I think that there's interest in sort of my unifying theme in the book as to what makes cities successful or not successful. And so the way I introduce the book is, this is a general history. The book itself covers political, economic, social, cultural history. There's history of immigration movement in Boston, history of race relations, history of sports teams, music, theater, comedy. But what ties it together is, as I say in the intro, that this is not meant to be an uncritical history, that I talk about tenets of good urbanism, what makes cities successful, and throughout the book, continue to ask questions of, are these policies successful ones or not successful ones? And so I think that interests a lot of people. And the themes that can then be applied to cities elsewhere as well. So
do you hope people come away with it with a more critical view, or just a more informed view, or what is your goal for your reader?
As I say in the intro, I'm concerned about the challenges that the city faces today. And so I wanted to look at the history as well as studying writing as to what makes cities successful, so we can look to the past to try to learn those lessons so that Boston going forward can be more like the Boston from the 1990s through today, as well as what Boston was like in the 19th century when it grew so much, and much less like Boston in the 20th century.
So it seems like it's maybe not a roadmap, but something that other cities and people who don't know Boston could really benefit from as well. It's not just a native audience.
I hope so, yeah. I've done interviews on radio shows or podcasts around the country in Cincinnati, Omaha, Lawrence, Kansas, Kenosha, Wisconsin,
wow.
New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Orlando,
talk to your booking agent.
Cincinnati. So there seems to be quite a bit of interest from around the country using Boston as a model for what makes cities successful or not successful.
Well, the book definitely warrants attention. It's like I said, I've lived here all my life, and I learned a lot, and definitely enjoyed doing so, and very much enjoyed having you with all that you do, that you could take the time. We're very grateful. Thank you, Dan. Congratulations on the great book. And thank you all for joining us on the Writer's Block. Please check out Dan's book and his local classes. and keep visiting us. We'll see you soon.